This is the Nielsen Norman Group UX podcast. I'm Therese Fessenden. Today's episode covers easily one of the most underrated UX topics out there, accessibility. Quick history lesson about accessibility in the US. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, and the World Wide Web was made public in 1993. So, it's unsurprising that many people assume that digital accessibility isn't a novel concept. After all, ADA law predates the internet. So certainly most design and development standards already account for accessibility, right? But this assumption couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, truly accessible design is still incredibly rare, and it's only in recent years that it's become part of the mainstream conversation. So, to explore this topic, we chatted with UX researcher and product designer Steph Walter. Stephanie's based in Luxembourg as a lead UX design consultant at Maltem, and she has over a decade of experience working in the realm of enterprise and financial UX. She also teaches classes on mobile and responsive design and has a wealth of knowledge about accessibility that she regularly publishes. So in this episode, she shares a bit about what got her interested in accessibility to begin with, what accessibility truly means in the realm of UX, some common misconceptions, and finally, how designers can start to create more inclusive experiences. I'm excited for you to hear this episode because this was a really fun one for me. So I hope you enjoy. With that, here's Steph. Stephanie, thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk to you about accessibility, about neurodiversity, and a lot of other great topics. And I know one of the reasons I reached out to you is you've been putting out a ton of findings, observations, resources around accessibility and accessible designs. Was there a moment or something that maybe sparked your interest and catalyzed your desire to share this information with other people?
Yeah, so I've met different people with different disabilities in my life. Like my mom used to work for a deaf person, and she would bring me along, and the lady was able to read on my lips. So this is why kind of like the first time I met someone with a visible disability at least. And we talked about disability a little bit in my master degree when we were talking about usability. And I had a student with a wheelchair in my class. And I discovered how even when you are doing things on the usability and at a university, people were so kind of ableist against my friend. I remember there was one teacher who was talking to my friend as if she was 5 years old, very patronizing. And at some point we snapped, another friend of mine was she's in a master degree with all of us. Just because she's in a wheelchair doesn't mean she has less cognitive abilities than we all do. So please talk to her like you talk to any other students. So I was come on, that was very, very annoying. So I kind of had the unfortunately also a chance to see firsthand and how people get treated when they have a disability. Mm-hmm. So the concept of disability and all of that was something I understood, but I didn't really know when I was studying that was this thing called accessibility that was really focusing on how do we make things accessible for disabled users. You usually hear about building accessibility, but not that much about web accessibility or product services accessibility. So I kind of started digging into it via blog posts, via some conferences. And when I worked in France, the agency I was working for was actually specialized in accessible code. So they trained me in accessible code first. And then from the code, I was yeah, okay, but it's nice that you do something in code. But if your mockups are not accessible, you already have a kind of single point of failure before that. Is the developer going to correct your contrast issues, for instance? It should not be the developer's job. So I was you know what? Maybe designers need to know about accessibility too. And there were not a lot of resources at that time for designers. Like I remember Laura Kalbag, she wrote a book about accessibility for everyone. And she, I think, was one of the first person who I saw was talking about accessibility, but also from a designer point of view. I was like, yeah, we need more resources. So I started kind of digging in and saying, okay, what can we do? What can we bring to the world to make this kind of more knowledge available for designers as well? Because you can fix a lot of issues already in the design phase. So that would be the idea.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's funny how you phrased it as kind of, you had the chance, or rather the unfortunate chance, to see some of these more ableist scenarios firsthand, or some of these major hurdles that a lot of disabled people have to overcome in order to not just use designs like in the context of digital, environments, but really just to kind of live day-to-day life, which I think is maybe at the root of all accessibility nowadays. So I guess to backtrack a little bit, for those who might be newer to the field, how would you define like accessibility in UX? Because I know you mentioned there's accessibility in buildings. UX accessibility might be a bit different. So how would you kind of define it or make sense of it?
So it's about making sure that people with different types of disability can perceive the web, interact with it, and also contribute to the web. So it's not just about being able to consume the information, but like being able to also be part of the conversation, which is also very, very important. And often we think about blind people when we talk about accessibility. Usually it's the first thing that comes to mind, but there's kind of a lot of different disabilities, and there's also a spectrum, which means that people have different degrees of a disability. And it's also not a fixed point in life. You can have a disability that will kind of move, some unfortunately degenerate, so get worse. But also at some point you have people who have temporary disabilities, like you might have an arm in a bandage or something like that. Or you might have something like someone might have chronic fatigue, which means that in the morning they would be perfectly fine. And then all of a sudden in the afternoon, they do not have any energy anymore. And maybe they need to have a wheelchair in the afternoon while they were walking in the morning. Or maybe you have someone with a cognitive disability who is perfectly okay at some point. And during the day, they do not have any energy anymore. They get brain fog, and then they cannot do a cognitive task anymore. So it's kind of very important, I think, to help people understand it's a spectrum. So you have different things on the spectrum. You have auditory impairment, which are people with different degrees, again, of hearing loss. So here, if you think about design and UX, you think about, okay, we need to make sure that if we are designing Zoom, for instance, or like any video conferencing tool, we need to design a place to have captions. And if you're like working at Netflix, for instance, they had captions, but until I think a couple of months ago, you could not like configure them. So it was very annoying, because if you have like an anime with a very light background, the caption was white and it was next to impossible to read. So you might think like, yeah, okay, as a designer, there's not a lot of things I can do for people with auditory impairment, but actually there is. It's like you need to be aware of those things and need to be aware of what you can do in your interface to make things better. Then you have cognitive disabilities and learning disabilities. So this is usually things like dyslexia, ADHD, autism, but also people with brain injury, with mental disability, someone with long COVID who has issues with their cognitive capabilities. So here I think is the most understood one, because it's very invisible. Unless someone talks to you about it, it's very hard to know that someone has a cognitive disability unless they are very open about it. And here, I think as UXer, we have a lot of things to do, because we work on information architecture, we work on UX writing, we can work on making tasks easier, we can work on memory. Like we talk a lot in UX of the Miller law, it's like this magic number. This magic number is about memory. So there's a lot of overlaps when it comes to cognitive disability, because often people in the UX field also are into the cognitive science field. And So there's actually a lot of things that can be done. And then physical disabilities. So this is what we think about too, like weakness, limited muscular control, like someone not able to use their mouse who might use a keyboard, or someone not able to use their hands at all who might use a head stick. So they will have a little stick on there and they will type or like put the stick on the touch screen, things like that. So here designers can think about guidelines for keyboard navigation, things like that. Making sure that labels are properly labeled. If you think about someone who will control their screen with voice, they will literally talk to their screen. So the stuff in the screen needs to have names. Otherwise, they cannot say, click that button that has a name, something like that. Mm-hmm. We have speech, which are people who have difficulty to talk. So again, often we think about muteness, but it also involves people with different levels. So like someone who stutters a lot, or someone who has maybe a facial paralysis that makes their pronunciation very hard. We have more and more tools with AI tool where you can talk to the AI tool. But if we do not train the model on people who do not have the perfect American English with different accents around the world, but also different disabilities, it will be very, very, very hard to use. Mm-hmm. And then last one is visual. This is the one we usually think about the most, like people who are blind, partially, completely, also colorblind people. So people who cannot perceive the colors. And here again, there's a lot of things designer can do for screen reader support, but also like, color support and stuff like that. So there's kind of a wide range. And I think most designers, they hear about accessibility and they think about, okay, colors. And then they think, okay, but a screen reader is something technical. There's nothing I can do about that. But you're like, look, if you are going to design an interface where you replace a button with a label by an icon, this icon needs to be read by the screen reader. And it's not your developer's job to try to guess based on your icon what you want this to read. It's your designer job to say, okay, this icon should have been that label. And this is is it safe? Is it shared? So here again, there's a lot of things about communicating the intent and intention of the design. And that's whole part of the UX design and UX research as well.
Yeah. So what I'm taking away from this is, first off, there's such a massive spectrum of different kinds of disabilities that we can be considering in our design process. So that's the first spectrum. But even within each of these different types of disabilities, there is a spectrum of ability or disability within that. Like you were saying, there's someone who might have an injured arm, for example. Maybe they went skiing and broke their arm. Then, okay, their arm is temporarily disabled. They still would like to do the things they normally do, like order their food, to get delivered to their house, or to, order some groceries for them. So that certainly is another way to reframe accessibility, not so much as, oh, we're designing for all these people with lifelong conditions, although certainly that is a group of people we are designing for, but that these sorts of benefits, if we are to design for those folks, those benefits extend far beyond just those long-term disabled folks. And the other thing that comes to mind too is, like you're saying, with the cognitive side of things, it's very rare for people to think about, at least from different clients that I've worked with, very rare for folks to think about, how can I make sure this is readable by dyslexic folks? And that conversation spans beyond font choice, for example. I know there are dyslexic oriented fonts, but there's more to that, more to content writing than just picking a font and calling it good as well. So it sounds like there's plenty of opportunity to explore. And I know probably we're not going to get to all of that in this podcast because there's just so much to talk about. But I think that's a really healthy way of looking at it as well.
Yeah, and it's usually about making it easier for everyone. Like one of the things with dyslexia is using simpler words, simpler sentences, and also like letting the people actually choose the font. Because I have friends with dyslexia who hate the open dyslexia. They're like, no, I cannot read that. So it's a little bit tricky because the way you read is also highly influenced by the font you're used to see on a daily basis. So for them, they're like, well, I prefer to be able to switch the font. and I'm using a screen reader. So they might not use the same screen reader as a blind person, but my friend bought, I don't remember the name, but basically we do D&D together, and they have a tool that that reads the D&D PDF for them. So they do not need to read it themselves as a dyslexic person. They just listen to it, which is also a help. And this is usually something you don't think about. You're like dyslexia, okay, I need to work on the font, the text, like, or you can remove the need to read at all in this specific case.
Yeah, that's really amazing to think about how creative people are at solving their particular challenges. And it's actually funny you mentioned that screen reading tool. Like for me, as someone, I struggle with attention myself. And one of my ways of overcoming that difficulty is to have I also have like a PDF reader basically, and there's different voices I can choose. And so I can put on this, I can take an academic paper, for example, just throw on some headphones, walk outside and listen to the findings in this paper. And sometimes that's even better for my attention span than, another mode or method. So it's a lot. It sounds like designing for accessibility is not just, tweaking the visuals, but also considering that there's many other modes and many other ways to engage with that particular content, for sure. Now, I have another question here about making accessible designs. I know we kind of talked about some common pitfalls, like, people tend to err on the side of like picking colors and saying, okay, I have accessible colors, my accessibility is good to go. What else do you think might stop teams from making accessible designs?
So I will start with the positive idea, which is like, I think most people would like to if they knew how to. And I think it's like a lack of knowledge. You cannot know what you do not know. So if you've never heard about accessibility, why would you want to do that? Because you do not even know it exists. So like a couple of years ago, I think there was a picture of a blind person in the metro using a screen reader. And like, I don't remember if it was Gizmodo or anyone under this kind of news was like, let's not pretend that person can use a phone. It's like, yeah, they can. They totally can use a phone. So even in like the general population, you have people who think that a blind person cannot use a phone. Well, if you ask anyone who knows a little bit about accessibility, they will be like, actually, like a lot of blind people use a lot their phones because it's amazing to have a small computer in your pocket or something like that. But this is kind of general, like lack of knowledge and high level of ableist society that doesn't kind of showcase the fact that, disabled people can do a lot of things also. So you would start with education of developers who do not usually get taught about how to technically make a website accessible, and also education to designers and like general education about this kind of degrees of disability, so that we understand that it's not always kind of one way or one point. It's, as I said, kind of an umbrella. It moves around. It really depends on the people, and understand kind of the diversity of disability, which is a little bit weird. I think it's also very, very important. So I would say, like educating people would be a first step. But then if you educate people, most of the time you educate designers, developers, you are at bottom to top. The problem is then those people might be educated, they might want to do things, and then they hit a wall where you'll have stakeholders manager who will say, but we don't have blind users. We don't really need to make the website accessible. And then you're like, welcome to Survivor Bias 101. Maybe you do not have blind users because your website is not accessible. Ever thought about that? I had the case, like I was working for some people who were like, but the website is generating 20% of the revenue, so we're not investing that much in the website. I was like, have you tried to use your own website? Maybe if it was better, it would generate more revenue. And that's exactly the same thing. Like if your website is not accessible to blind people. I was working on an e-commerce website where you could not access the basket via keyboard navigation. So you could add stuff in the basket, but then you can never access the basket with keyboard. So you need a mouse to access the basket. I was like, of course you do not have blind people or keyboard users who buy from you because they cannot buy from you, because they cannot access your basket to actually buy from you. So yeah, that's indeed a big problem. So when you have like this kind of, we need to make a business case for accessibility, I was like, that's kind of a false argument. Is at some point, you need to make it accessible because it's the right thing to do. And also like, yes, disabled people have money.
Yeah.
So they would like to be consumers as well. And there's like a lot of talk in like disability communities. So if something is great, usually they will talk about it and they will recommend it to other people, because having something that is accessible is kind of still a little bit rare in some areas. So if you have a product that is very, very good, you will get more consumers for sure. And then I think the last thing, I don't really like the argument, but it's like the regulation one, is to say, look, if you're in the US, the UK, we already have a lot of laws on accessibility. In Europe, European Accessibility Act is coming next year. And so for now in Europe, public website institutions have compliance regulations around accessibility. Spoiler alert, a lot are not compliant, but okay. They didn't get fines, I think, for now, because it's public website. In 2025, European Accessibility Act is coming to all the countries in Europe. And then if you have a commercial website and even a private website, but you're selling things to people, you will need to comply with a very specific set of rules about accessibility. It's basically based on the WCAG, which is the kind of main entity when you talk, plus a couple of other ones. So they added extra things to go beyond WCAG, but that's it. And it's not just like website, like any digital product. If you have a smart TV, if you have e-reader, for instance, it should be accessible. So I'm very curious to see where this is going to send the e-readers and all of that. So yeah, that's kind of unfortunately the last argument, which is, you have to be, because law and compliance.
Yeah. Right. And actually that last one, as good as it is to have laws that protect people who have disabilities and, hopefully help move most products and services toward being accessible, the flip side of that is sometimes people use like easy button solutions. Like what comes to mind is there have been these accessibility plugins. And I'm trying to remember, I know one of them was like Accessibility, and they faced a really massive lawsuit because they kind of promised to a lot of organizations, we'll make your website compliant, just use this plugin and everything's going to be, readable on a screen reader. The problem is though, it just simply acted as a screen reader, and also it kind of interfered with people's existing screen reader technology that they had. It made it worse, right? And so what is kind of I don't want to say the problem with the regulations, but the problem with the motivation behind only being compliant is that sometimes people don't actually end up doing the thing that helps them be compliant. And then they kind of look for the shortcut to that compliance.
Yeah, they look for the quick fix.
Yeah. Exactly. And on the bright side, though, I do think there is a lot more interest. Like you're saying, there are people who are starting to learn more about accessibility and realize, hey, actually, there's a lot more opportunity here to make this accessible, not just to people with disabilities, but people who might be temporarily excluded or having difficulty in some way. And I do think that cognitive reframing, in a way of like, hey, we're just making this usable to more people, makes accessibility less overwhelming and less scary, I think.
Yeah, and sometimes you do not have to do a lot of things. That's also the thing. If the website was designed properly, it's mostly fixing code issues. So that's the thing. If you fix it, if you develop it properly, you do not need to fix it later. So it's always the same. It's like it costs a lot of money to fix a website that was poorly developed. And it's even worse if it was fully developed for accessibility. But if you start from the beginning, it doesn't have to cost much more money. It's just about using the right tags and making sure it works properly. And like in the design, it's the same. You do not get paid by how many colors you use in your color palette. You just need to check that they work together for contrast or something like that. So for me, it becomes kind of, maybe if you work in Agile, kind of definition of done, definition of ready. It's like, did we check the mockups for accessibility problems? In the code, it's the same. You cannot automate all the accessibility in code, but you can run some automation to kind of give you a first idea. So here again, you could have some things where you run automation before pushing to code. It's like, oh, look, your image doesn't have an alternative text. You should do something about this and that and that. So if you like include it from the beginning of the project when you start, it doesn't have to cost that much more money. And it's weird because you do not think like that about security. Like, let's do something and we'll fix security later. Well, no. So that's the thing. It's like, for security, you wouldn't remove it from the invoice or remove it from the quote and we'll do it when someone complains. Well, some do actually, but usually it's not the case. So it should be the same for accessibility. It should be kind of part of the designer job, developer job, and then it would become kind of a natural thing to do into the process.
Yeah. And actually on that note too, it helps to have the set of guidelines to start with, right? To kind of know what are the things to be thinking about. And for me, when I was newer, I had zero idea about the guidelines. And so now, just to kind of help some of the folks who are newer here listening to this episode, if you want to know about some of these standards, there is actually an overseeing body for internet accessibility. And I say internet accessibility kind of broadly because it's both websites as well as, applications and anything that's basically connected to the internet. But the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, dictates what constitutes accessible design, and they are regularly putting out these guidelines. And so, as you mentioned, Stephanie, the WCAG, or WCAG as it's sometimes referred to, that stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And they're regularly updating. I think the latest version is 2.2, and there's a draft currently in the works for 3.0, which is supposed to make things easier to understand, make the guidelines themselves easier to understand, but also we'll probably have some more enhancements or improvements to the existing guidelines. So anyway, if you are looking into, okay, where do I start? How do I learn about these? Those are absolutely a great place to begin. Now, Stephanie, I guess I have one more question for you, which is, could you offer any advice for teams who are currently struggling to get their management? Because like you said, sometimes there is an interest, but then some folks are saying, well, my manager doesn't think this is, worth the time. Like, what advice can we give those folks?
So I would say show don't tell often works nicely to build empathy. So there's, I will send you the link. You can put it in the notes. Like the W3C has very nice videos that show how people with disability use the web. So this would be part of, again, educating people about disability and making them understand that, people with different disabilities use the web with different ways, different tools, and we need to support that. I would say also, if you run usability testing, sometimes you can tell something to a stakeholder 10 times. They will not listen until you show them a user actually struggling with that. So if you're running usability testing on your website and you're running it with disabled people, I think it would be very interesting also to show to your stakeholders and the people in charge who are not sold on making the website accessible. Look, this is how bad it is for some people. So usually, if you want to build empathy with people who do not know anything about the topic, you need to show them how the topic is going to impact them. And I would also say, start somewhere. Maybe start with colors because it's the easiest way. But the fact that you start somewhere means you start it. And then you will start with colors, and it will open a discussion, and you will start opening the Pandora box. And from color, you might start talking about keyboard accessibility and all of that. And then you might have a designer who knows nothing about keyboard accessibility, who will ask to be trained. And you'll have discussions and things like that among the people in the team to try to understand a little bit better. So it's having a place to start and to start a discussion, even if it's very, very small. You will not fix all the accessibility problem of your website in 2 days. but you need to start. That's the thing. And from what I've seen, usually when people start somewhere, then this is just like the first little step. And then you can build on top of this little step and improving it like little by little. And then usually people get curious, like, but why can't we use this color? Then you can explain with the contrast. And so it's also kind of another way to build empathy, which is explaining as a designer why you take those design decisions, because this is how it will impact people. And it's the same with usability. Why did I put the button here and not here? Because this will impact people like that and like that. And here again, you're kind of building empathy with the users and with users with different abilities and disabilities to help people actually become the advocates in your own company. And yeah, then the legal route is always an interesting one. So you have a lot of companies who have diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. I would say if a company has that, I would totally weaponize the bullshit they put on their website. It's like, if you tell me, if I work for you and you have a very nice page on your website about diversity and all of that, it's like, oh, you're interested into inclusion and diversity and all of that. Okay, let's put your money where your mouth is then. So if they're like trying to surf on the trend of diversity, equity, inclusion, I would use that to push accessibility. Maybe it's a little bit sneaky, but at some point, if you pretend to do it, let's do it for real. At least. I'm not saying all companies pretend, to be clear. A lot actually care, but it can be kind of another way to jump on the bandwagon to say, oh, we have this initiative. Maybe accessibility could be part of that as well.
I think that's a really healthy way to look at it, is to think about, yes, you can do it from the inside out, right? Taking your existing research, showing it to your manager, building the empathy by showing what people actually go through. It's hard to really argue when you witness something being truly, horrendous for somebody. But the other side of it is to go top down in a way. And if an organization is trying to exhibit certain values, right, to try to align some of these efforts with those projected values, as, hey, our organization is focusing on some of these DEI efforts. Here's a really great way to do it. And not only that, this is something we can even brag about later, right? This can serve as like press for the organization to say, hey, here's an effort we're taking. So yes, it's sneaky, but at the same time, it can serve like two purposes. It can be a great way to kind of differentiate an organization and say, hey, we're doing something that's truly helping people. And kind of to your point earlier, you said that it's rare to have really well-designed, accessible interfaces, right? And one of the classes I teach is emerging patterns in interface design. And we have a whole section in the course dedicated to accessibility. And I remember there were a couple times some people would be like, well, accessibility is not new. It's been around, especially in the US. The Americans with Disability Act, the ADA law, has been around for a long time, since the 90s. So when we have this section, sometimes folks are like, accessibility is not new. It's like, well, no, it's not new. But what is new is the fact people are finally being serious about it, and people are finally putting their efforts into these. And so, yes, it is emerging in the sense that these interfaces are rare and awesome when they do exist. So maybe there can be, more of that into the future. So yeah, I hate that it's in the emerging patterns class, but I'm glad that it is something that seems to be gaining more momentum over time.
But the thing is, we have new patterns that get created all the time, like drag and drop didn't exist a couple of years ago. And now we use that a lot, and it has issues with accessibility, and we may need to make that accessible. And if you think about interacting with AI, for instance, like that also brings a lot of new things, but it also means these new things need to be accessible too. So for me, there will always be emerging accessibility pattern, because there will always be emerging patterns. So for me, it totally makes sense to teach it as a emerging in an emerging pattern field, for sure.
Absolutely. And thank you for validating that, because I always feel the same way. There's constantly new things. Yes. Thank you. Well, Stephanie, it has been so fun talking about accessibility, learning from the wealth of knowledge you have, and being able to continue sharing that with others. To close, I know that you are regularly putting out lots more information about how people can make accessible designs, are there certain places you could point people to for where they can continue to find this stuff?
I'll do self promotion. I need to put the link. I have accessibility, an article where I basically put all the resources I find interesting for designer, and it's called Accessibility for Designer. Where do I start? So I will put you in the notes. Then the W3C, as I said, they have amazing people who write all of those things, who take the videos, who make sure that you have all this information about accessibility for free. So there's a lot of places where you can basically go and learn about that without even having to pay. And then once you're ready, there's also like good paying courses. The one I really like is Sarah Sweden has one about practical accessibility. It's more for developers, but even as a designer, she talks a lot about design patterns and all of that. So you might be a little bit lost once she just starts talking about JavaScript, but there's still a lot of very interesting things in there. So yeah, there's a lot of resources.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing those. And I believe your website is stephaniewalter.design. So if you want to learn more about Stephanie, please do feel free to check that out. But anyway, just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. It has been so fun.
Thanks for having me.
That was Stéphanie Walter. You can find all the links that she's just mentioned in the show notes. But also, don't forget, we have on our website lots of articles and videos about accessible design, inclusive research, as well as many others about UX design, research, strategy, and UX careers. So to learn more about all of that, go to our website, www.nngroup.com. That's NNGROUP.com. Finally, if you enjoy this show in particular, please follow or subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. This show is hosted and produced by me, Therese Fessenden. All production and editing is by Chrissy Richardson. That's it for today's show. Until next time, remember, keep it simple.